Hey everybody. So I want to talk about procedural generation, but this isn't going to be a nice little nugget of wisdom. I'm still working it out myself. If you are here just for useful stuff, maybe skip this one. But if you like to think about game design, feel free to watch this and let me know what your opinions are. I've been designing procedural generation techniques for a really long time. I've been procedurally generating things forever. And I've only just started to realize how much of that was cargo cult procedural generation. Now, if you're not aware, a cargo cult is a fictional cult that springs up on islands where, when World War II ended and the US and the British flew away and abandoned their air bases, the natives would, the story goes, build their own Wicker radio towers and try and wave down planes to get their cargo. And of course, it never worked because a Wicker radio tower can't call anybody, and there's no connection to the overall, Air Force or anything like that. So I think that the cargo cult myth is a myth. I don't think it ever actually happened. But this way of thinking definitely does happen, and it's definitely happening in procedural generation. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what that might mean and how to break out of it. Let's go ahead and start with something simple. If you're generating characters, wow, those aren't really very well formed E's. If you're generating characters, how do you generate the characters? Do you assign them traits? Traits similar to what you might assign a character you were writing, whether those are visual traits or statistical traits or whatever. That's how you normally do it. When you're generating an NPC, you pick from a grab bag of traits and you give them the traits, and then you show the player and you say, hey, look, here is a random NPC for you. I think that that's cargo culty. That is a Wicker radio tower of an NPC. It's not connected to anything. It's not going to get any planes to land. Let's go ahead and talk about the difference, because when we do that, we're just copying the scent of how a real written character operates. So let's go ahead and talk about a real written character. Let's go ahead and talk about Garrus. Garrus is a great example of how to write a character into your game. Garrus's character isn't really very deep, but he's tied to the game. All of his characterization is there so that he can explain what it means to be a renegade, why you might want to be a renegade, what sort of problems it might fix or cause. Now, being a renegade, that's like 50% of the player morality, so Garrus is responsible for explaining 50% of what the player should think about when it comes to morality. That's a pretty big burden, and he carries it off quite well. All of his traits support him exploring that. All of his plot points support him exploring that. Everything he has to say or do is about that. And as the games progress, his style gets more nuanced, and his traits change, and he takes battle damage, and he starts to get different kinds of opinions on what sort of nature being a renegade is, and what sort of places it might be useful and might not be. This all combines very, very well to make Garrus a beloved character. Even though there's nothing particularly interesting about his fundamental character, he doesn't have to be fundamentally interesting because he's wired into the fundamentals of the universe. So he doesn't have to have a complex backstory. He doesn't have to have a special psychic power. All he has to do is tell the player what it's like to be a renegade, because that's a big part of the game. Similarly, we've got a character like Liara. Liara is a generic blue tentacle lady, and she has no interesting characteristics at all. She's kind of cute and extremely nerdy, and that's it. Her role in the game is to explain the plot. More than that, her role is not just to explain the plot, it's to be excited about the plot. Her role is to tell the player how awesome this Prothean stuff is, and how lucky the player is to be part of it, and how awesome everything is. And that's her only role. Her only role is to help the player get excited about the core plot of the game. But just like Renegade is half of the player's moral experience, the Prothean plot is half of the plot of the game. So having a character that's excited about it results in a character that's tied so tightly to the plot that it feels like they have a ton of things to say and do, and all they're really doing is being excited about the plot. Neither of these characters, Garrus or Liara, have any sort of interesting design to them. There are some interesting physical characteristics, but they're shared by their species. So there's nothing terribly unique about them as an individual. This is true of all of the NPCs in at least the first 2 games. Every single one of them is quite generic for their species, but they're so deeply tied into the themes of the universe that they all feel like they always have something interesting and compelling to say. And that is the nature of a character. You build a character with the traits they need to help you tell the story, and then you have them help you tell the story. Now, when you're generating characters at random, you're not really wiring them into the story. You're not really wiring them into the themes of the universe. Instead, you're just creating things that kind of look like they might be characters. And all you're going to get out of that is a vague preference, like the player happens to like blondes or whatever, so he selects the blonde guy. There's not really going to be any sort of compelling element to that. And the reason is because there can't be. They're not wired in. They're just a picture. So, if you see like 800 different characters lined up and you can choose, 8 of them to be your party, and there's Garrus and there's Liara right there in the random array of characters, you wouldn't notice them. They'd just be a generic Turian and a generic Asari. Their backstory would be half a line and like +2 to guns or something like that. So that wouldn't make them compelling. They couldn't be compelling in that situation because they have no wiring. They're not wired into the game at all. In order to make them compelling, we would have to wire them in, and that's a little bit difficult because you have to get them to have screen time, and a core part of what this sort of game is would be the characters don't have any screen time. The player chooses who gets screen time. So that's a difficult hurdle to jump, but it's worth considering how you're going to do that because it's necessary. If they're just going to be visual stamps with like a trait, that's not going to be compelling. Maybe it can be made compelling later, like the player chooses the ones he wants and then they get wired in. Surprise, this person's actually going to explain the Protheans for the rest of the game. That might be fun, but I need to stress that simply stamping out traits isn't going to make your characters interesting. It's going to be a Wicker radio tower. It's going to look interesting at first glance, but it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. So, what if we talked about a different challenge? What if we talked about generating quests? I have no idea whether I'd spelled generate before correctly. It was super clumsy. But let's talk about generating quests. This is something that comes up a lot as well. You want to be able to create an endless array of quests. Now, if you look at quests in scripted games, it's pretty easy to come up with a randomizer for that. Sure, I can create a fetch quest. Sure, I can create a hunting quest. Sure, I can do this and that. But in a good game, at least, those quests aren't random. Those quests exist to help to further the game's world. If old lady A asks you for soap, then the point is that you are now aware of what sort of circumstances the locals live in, who old lady A is, what the dynamics of this world are, and you're being given a chance to prove that you're helpful, to help someone. If old lady A then immediately turns around and asks you to go out for something else, you're going to start to lose that connection because you've already had this stuff defined, and you've already helped, and unless you can come at it from a different angle, it's just repeating the same note over and over and over. Similarly, if you want to, rescue kid from wolves, pretty easy to create an infinite number of variants on this, but the point of rescue kid from wolves is to show the player at that point that their party of characters is starting to take on the world. Their party of characters is starting to act instead of react. They are going to go out there. They're going to face a challenge. They're going to rescue a kid. They're going to bring that kid home. The wilds are dangerous. They're full of wolves. There's quite a mountain to climb. If you have 8 different hunting quests, then that's not going to feel the same way. It's going to be just, oh, look, we have to go kill more shit. It doesn't build the world. It doesn't build on any themes. It just is random crap. And that's a real problem with me. So I've been thinking about how to generate quests more deeply, how to have something that actually helps the world. And I think that a big part of that is the context. And for a long time I was thinking about, what sort of generative narrative elements can you use? And at first I was thinking about superheroes because, who has more obvious generative variants than superheroes, right? But here's the problem with superheroes. There's not really any context. It's just good and bad, and here is some boxing. There's the overall characterization of superheroes is pretty poor, and most of what people remember about them is the one core nugget that makes a given character great. And then that gets explored in a couple different variants, and then it gets rebooted, and rebooted, and rebooted, and rebooted. So we see Spider-Man struggle with the nature of power forever, and it's always the same 4 or 5 Spider-Man stories, just told with slightly different casts. If there was a long-running Spider-Man series that didn't reboot, Spider-Man series that never rebooted, Spider-Man would have to go to greater lengths and tell weirder stories in order to keep the people's attention. And that's exactly what happened, and that's why so many Spider-Man comics suck. It's because they stopped relying on the core heart of, Spider-Man and started having to throw clones and crap into the mix in just a desperate attempt to hold people's attention. The problem is that any game is going to have enough content that you're going to burn through that threadbare little piece of context real fast. So how can you generate something that has more context? How can you generate something that has lasting context that will keep the player's attention for long enough? And I think the answer is to tie the characters much more deeply into the nature of the world. So superheroes are pretty much like they stand alone. There's not really very many games where there are a lot of complicated superhero factions, or where certain superheroes have power type X and certain superheroes have power type Y, and that's why they conflict and stuff like that. Normally a superhero is not about the fundamental nature of the world. It's about the fundamental nature of that superhero, and that aspect perhaps of the world. But if we're talking about tying things in much more deeply into the world, we're going to have to come up with something a lot more structured. Something like Mass Effect is a reasonably good example because you have a lot of different factions in that world. Each species is its own faction. The Citadel is its own faction, and you can have all those factions squabble, and each one of them is tied to some fundamental theme of the universe. But that's a lot of space. That's big. You need to go smaller, or you're going to burn through a lot of content when you're generating your quests. It's only so many giant space stations you can have before you realize that they all look the same. So I was just playing Vampire Bloodlines, which, if you haven't played it, it's an older game, which is based on the White Wolf vampire mythos. And I'm not a fan of Vampire. It's the crappiest of the White Wolf games, and it's just bad. But I like Bloodlines. It's a decent game. It falls apart at the end, but it's an interesting enough game. And one of the things that's interesting about it is that there are factions. Each of the vampire bloodlines has its own group, and then of course they also all work together in 3 or 4 different groups of people. So you get this grid of, you know, people who are working together and people who aren't working together, and there's this constant flux of like, is X going to work with Y? Is Z going to work with G? Whatever, right? Who's fighting who? What's going on here? And so in the end, what you end up with is an ever-shifting political environment, and it's small. It fits into one town. In fact, it fits into 4 blocks. So this is a fairly compelling sort of feeling, a fairly compelling approach. How can you create random events in this situation? Well, it's pretty easy. All of your random quests can simply be tied to the various factions, either these factions here competing or cooperating, these factions here competing or cooperating, or these factions competing and cooperating with some fundamental theme. For example, if there is a plague that is in your city, then everyone's going to want to solve that plague. That might turn out that someone's at the root of it, but no one is going to go and say, yeah, we're actually going to sit this one out. Everybody's going to go, hey, you should probably look into that. So you get people who cooperating when they normally wouldn't. On the other hand, if it's like a contest between one vampire group and another vampire group, but they're both in the same overall social faction, it might be a very tense and secretive affair where you're not supposed to kill anybody. On the other hand, if it's just between the one vampire group, but they're in 2 different social factions and they're trying to decide, you know, which of these social factions should have the majority of that family's attention, then all of these things start to suddenly make a lot more sense. And all the player has to do is steadily become more and more aware of the different groups here and the different groups here. And as the player becomes more aware, you can introduce more nuanced quests and competitions. And individuals are part of several of these categories. And which category matters to them today could really, really be an important point. And they can even change. They can change categories. You might have someone that quits being the stuck-up people that are trying to maintain the masquerade, and instead switches over to being the shovel-headed guys who want to destroy everything. And it's like, yeah, why did he do that? I want to know. In this way, you could generate a fair amount of conflict. Obviously, this is quite similar to how it might be in Mass Effect with the different species and the different social categories, but it's not as well defined in Mass Effect because everybody is on the same side. It's civilization versus the Reapers, and that's really all it is. So the groups aren't really at each other's throats. There's not enough room to maneuver, and the generated quests are naturally going to start to become stale because it's always going to be like one politician hates another politician or one species hates another species. It's never going to be something where there's actual conflicts of interest where those characters are like, oh no, which side should I be on? You're never going to be able to tell a Turian to go, you know, go join the Reapers. It's not going to happen. If that's going to happen, the Reapers are going to do it for you, and that's going to be the first game. I hope what I'm saying is clearer than it sounds in my head, because I'm still working out exactly what I mean, and it might be kind of mumbly. But that's sort of what I've been thinking about. I've been thinking about how you wire people into the game world and how you wire generative content in, whether it's NPCs or quests or powers or planets, anything you can generate. I think we have to stop generating with the concept of traits, and we have to start generating with the concept of wiring that shit into the game. Because that's what characters and quests do. They are wired into the game. They are there to pull the player into the game. If they don't do that, they're not doing their job, and they are bad characters or bad quests. So all generative characters and quests that don't pull the player into the game, they're bad. And as far as I can tell, that's basically all of them. So I'm sort of feeling my way out into this new terrain here, and I'm hoping that maybe you have some advice or have some similar thoughts. Let me know down below, and if you made it this far, well, you're certainly better at staying awake than I am. I'm gonna go sleep.